Welcome to episode 81 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's January 20, 1987. Before dawn, the knock comes at the door. Not at a stadium gate, not at a turnstile, but at home. Because on this day, British police launch a coordinated set of early morning raids aimed at something football has lived with for decades and feared for the last 20 years. Organized hooliganism. This is Operation Fulltime. And today's story isn't just about fighting at matches. It's about how football became a stage for tribes, firms, and reputation, and how, by the late 1980s, the UK decided the only way to change the matchday culture was to treat it like organized crime. So today we'll do three things. We'll trace how the idiots and roughs around football became something darker, the firms of the 1970s and 80s. We'll tell the Operation Fulltime story itself, what it was, what it tried to prove, and why it mattered. And then we'll follow the line forward to Hillsborough, the Taylor Report, the Premier League era, and the question that keeps returning as to whether the pendulum has started to swing back. We start at the beginning, because football has never been a tea party. Long before the Premier League was a brand, long before stadiums were venues, England had folk football, chaotic, local, rough, and sometimes violent. Authorities tried to ban it as far back as the 1300s. Then the modern game arrives in the 1800s. Rules, clubs, railways, and crowds. And the same phenomenon appears almost immediately. The roughs, young men who attach themselves to the match and treat it as proving ground, not just entertainment. But here's the hinge. In the post-war decades, crowd trouble exists, but it's not yet systematized. And then in the 1960s, something changes. This is the era when Britain's football reputation starts to travel abroad as a warning label. Not because every fan is violent, of course, far from it, but because a visible minority begins to make violence part of the spectacle. By the 1970s, it's no longer random. It's a subculture, a pattern, a lifestyle. What do I mean by organized? I mean names, identity, and firms. Arsenal have the Herd, Chelsea have Headhunters, Millwall have Bushwackers, West Ham have the Inner City Firm, Manchester United have the Red Army, and Leeds have the Service Crew. This isn't just a crowd that gets out of hand. It's groups that travel, scout, recruit, and plan. And by the late 1970s and early 1980s, England is building physical infrastructure, fences, segregation, and pens, because the default assumption is that violence is coming. And that's the bitter irony. Some of the most infamous tragedies of the era are not caused by hooliganism, but they unfold in the football ecosystem, reshaped by the fear of it. 1985 is the year that tells you the country is losing patience. In March, over 100 people are arrested after serious crowd trouble disrupts the second leg of the League Cup semi-final between Chelsea and Sunderland. In response, Chelsea installs a live wire electric fence. I'm not kidding. Later in March, Kenilworth Road becomes a headline as Millwall hooligans riot before, during, and after their team's FA Cup quarter-final tie at Luton Town. On May 11, you have two disasters on the same day. In Bradford, the stadium catches fire and 56 people perish, and more than 200 are injured in the blaze. And at Birmingham versus Leeds, there's riot and disorder. Hooligans and fleeing fans are pushed up against a wall that collapses, and a 15-year-old boy is crushed to death in the collapse. On May 19, the Sunday Times publishes an editorial titled "Football in Crisis" and says that soccer is, quote, a slum sport played in slum stadiums increasingly watched by slum people, end quote. Then 10 days later, Heysel. May 29, 1985, the European Cup final, Liverpool versus Juventus. 39 people dead. A wall collapses again, but this time the spark is panic and violence in the stands. UEFA bans English clubs from its competitions. Hardly anyone protests. By now, hooliganism is no longer treated as embarrassing noise. It's treated as a national problem. So the official UK tries different answers. Stronger sentencing, alcohol controls around travel and match day, banning orders, intelligence units, CCTV, and increasingly, infiltration. This is also where police begin to treat firms less like rowdy fans and more like networks. And networks can be mapped. Names can be matched to faces, and faces can be matched to footage. Operation Fulltime is part of that new approach. It follows another operation against Birmingham's Zulu Warriors, and then comes the London strike. The targets were West Ham's Inner City Firm and Millwall's Bushwackers, and the method is the point, not simply reacting at the stadium, but building cases away from it, surveillance, infiltration, 5 months of watching, and then a coordinated dawn raid. On the morning itself, 250 officers and 26 suspects arrested at dawn. The message is unmistakable. Football violence is no longer going to be policed only at football. It's going to be policed like conspiracy. But here's where the story becomes more complicated and more revealing. Because when you move from "we saw you punch someone" to "we can prove you conspired," the legal burden changes. Evidence has to hold. Narratives have to survive court. And in some of these late 80s operations, cases collapsed. In the Operation Fulltime aftermath, some suspects are released and conspiracy charges are dropped, the prosecutions offering no evidence and cases dismissed. And that creates a second darker question. What exactly did infiltration mean? Were undercover officers simply observing, or were they shaping events? There are claims from defendants, reported at the time, that plainclothes officers standing among supporters urged them to organize bigger groups and escalated the temperature. Now, to be clear, that's a claim, not a settled fact. But even the existence of the claim tells you something about the era. The trust between football crowds and the authorities was already shattered. And when policing becomes covert, the suspicion becomes permanent. Still, the direction of travel is obvious. The state is no longer negotiating with football's disorder. It is attempting to dismantle it. And later that same year, courts begin to sound different. A judge sentences a group of prominent hooligans to long prison terms, explicitly framing them as organizers of sustained violence, not spontaneous troublemakers. Now fast forward, because Operation Fulltime is not the end of the story. It's the prelude to the next turning point. April 1989, Hillsborough. 97 die in a crowd crush. And in the immediate aftermath, one instinct returns automatically. Blame the supporters, assume disorder, assume hooliganism. But the long arc of Hillsborough does something profound. It forces England to separate two things that had become entangled. One is crowd safety, and the other is crowd control. Because Hillsborough was not hooliganism. It was a catastrophic failure of policing and safety management, later recognized as such in the legal record. And the Taylor Report becomes the blueprint for remaking English football as an environment, not just safer, but fundamentally different. Fences come down. Stadiums are rebuilt or redesigned. Seating replaces pens. Stewarding becomes professionalized. CCTV becomes standard. And crucially, the sport begins to understand that you cannot build a healthy football culture by treating everyone like a suspect. At the same time, the state's anti-disorder toolkit expands and becomes more durable. Banning orders, passport surrender for high-risk overseas fixtures, a legal infrastructure that can restrict a person's access to football as a condition of public order. And then comes the commercial revolution. 1992, the Premier League, a breakaway, new broadcasting money, a new product. Football becomes wealthier, stadiums become more comfortable, tickets become more expensive, and match going becomes less of a weekly street ritual and more of a planned consumer experience. For many clubs, that transformation is a liberation. For others, it's a trade, safety and comfort at the cost of some of the rawness that defined the old terraces. So what happened to hooliganism? It didn't vanish, it mutated. Much of the violence moves away from the stadium itself into pre-arranged meeting points, travel corridors, and the spaces where police visibility drops. It becomes less about wrecking the match day and more about staging the confrontation. And then, in recent years, the question returns again. Are we seeing a comeback? The most responsible answer is, it's not a return to the 1980s, but yes, a rise in recorded disorder indicators. And the data is nuanced. In recent seasons, football-related arrests in England and Wales rose, and banning orders increased too. But part of that rise is driven by changes in what is counted and how it is recorded. Class A drug possession included, overseas tournament links included, and improved reporting systems. Even so, what's striking is that the conversation is back. Public disorder, pyrotechnics, missile throwing, online hate, and the constant stress of policing a modern crowd. And that brings us back to why Operation Fulltime matters as a story marker. Because on this day in January 1987, the UK made a choice. It stopped treating football hooliganism as a football problem. It treated it as a state problem, one that justifies surveillance, raids, and conspiracy prosecutions. Did it work? Not immediately, not neatly, not without controversy. But it was part of a longer chain of decisions, legal, cultural, architectural, and economic, that eventually remade English football into something unrecognizable compared to the 1980s. And if the pendulum ever does swing back in a serious way, the lesson of 1987 is this. You don't fix football violence with slogans. You fix it with systems and with the courage to distinguish the game from the people who try to use it as a cover. So what should we take away from January 20, 1987? 3 points, as always. First, Operation Fulltime marked a shift in posture away from reacting to chaos at turnstiles and toward intelligence-led policing that treated firms as networks, monitored, mapped, and dismantled. Second, crackdowns can suppress symptoms, but they don't, by themselves, rebuild the matchday ecosystem. The deeper reset came when English football finally separated control from safety and redesigned the entire experience around crowd management, accountability, and dignity. And third, hooliganism doesn't disappear, it adapts. It moves offside, online, and into new triggers, and which is why the real long-term victory is not one operation, but a sustained system of bans, enforcement, stewardship, and a culture that refuses to normalize disorder again. On this day in 1987, the UK launched Operation Fulltime, and football's disorder stopped being treated as a football problem, and the lesson was simple. When violence becomes organized, you don't just police the match, you build the case, and you knock before dawn. That's all for episode 81 of OTD about Operation Fulltime. If you have an idea or memory you'd like me to research for an episode, please email me at otd@17lawsguy.com, and I'm grateful for a 5-star rating, your subscription, and if you tell a friend about this podcast. Tomorrow, in episode 82, we go to 1962 and the story of Ethiopia's first AFCON triumph. See you then.